they can be invited to these meetings as well. But just want to note that they tend to not be super helpful until your child is older, and they might not necessarily be able to come to the meeting. So just as a flag of the school might not invite them without you pushing for that, but if you feel like they should be a part of this meeting, so this could be representatives from DOORS or other agencies, is to help you, and they can't come without your consent, so you'd have to provide consent before they come. So this transition plan overall is going to outline where your child is at right now, the goals that they have, and then the services that they need to reach those goals. So we're going to break that down into the 4 parts of assessment, post-secondary goals, the course of study, and the services, and that's how it's broken down in your child's IEP. So talking first about assessment. So your child's transition plan should be based on age-appropriate assessments. And these can look very different. There are formal assessments and informal assessments, and they range in different things that they're looking at and how they assess your child. But they should be used to develop the plan itself. And because they're used to develop the plan, and when your initial transition plan is created, and those assessments should be done before that plan is created. So before your child turns 14 and a half, and before any goals or services are selected.
I just want to add here, I think probably I would say our experience across the board, this is an area where I think because it's not as carefully defined in the law, sort of what the guidelines are for what have to be part of transition assessments, that this is a place where I think a lot of school districts aren't necessarily as creative and supportive in the way that they should be. So if you have questions or issues related to this, is definitely something where we encourage you to, kind of give us a call. So again, they talk about formal and informal assessments, and perhaps through participating in other trainings, you guys know that the law also mandates school districts to do a full reevaluation of a student who's eligible to receive special education at least once every 3 years. However, because this is both formal and informal assessments, and because students' strengths, preferences, and interests can certainly change over time, it's something that the school should be doing as kind of an ongoing process. I think probably the most common examples of this that we see are career interest inventories that are not necessarily specific to students with disabilities, but just kind of more general, which isn't a bad thing. But, sometimes part of what's important for planning with kids with disabilities is not just understanding what their concrete interests are, but also are they interested in what the actual day-to-day sort of, kind of tasks that would be associated with a job, and is it, also reflective of what a student's strengths are. So it should be kind of a more deliberative process. And then also there is this resource that I think sometimes school districts will use, which is called the Casey Life Skills Inventory, which again is not a bad thing. It's sort of a questionnaire that the student and then people who are kind of working with the student, whether it be you guys as parents or other service providers in schools, to kind of see where students are up to in different areas of independent living, but kind of more like vocational rehabilitation evaluations, or things that are kind of going to assess kind of more situationally what a student is able to do, are things where I feel like school districts don't do a lot of it, and will rely pretty heavily on just the information that's gathered through that 3-year reevaluation process. But if you think about it timing wise, that basically means a kid's going to, in the best case scenario, get 2 of those kinds of evaluations during the time that they're in high school. So again, I think something that we, it's not kind of an emerging area of the law in terms of how we would enforce the rights of families to get access to more comprehensive evaluations. But I think it's probably an area where there's just a lot of kind of deficit in how school districts are approaching this.
Those transition assessments that Amanda was talking about should answer the questions about what your child wants to do after they graduate from school, where they want to live, and how they want to be involved in the community. So it's to look at those areas so that the transition plan can really address those needs. And Amanda touched a bit on some of these different types of transition assessments. And so they kind of range, and they can be behavioral focused, they can be vocational focused, depending on where your child is and what needs they have. And these will change over time. So it may be that those informal interest surveys are what your child needs when they first start their transition plan at 14 and a half, but as they get older, you want more focused assessments to figure out what they need and, as they progress through high school. So here's another poll question. Want to see where you're at how often has your child's school completed assessments? Never, once for the original plan, a few times a year. And like Amanda said, this is an area that we see a lot of issues in with schools not completing assessments or doing what it looks like some of you have seen of they do the original assessment and they do one every few IEP meetings, but they don't do it all the time. And so that's something that, if you're concerned about those assessments, we would ask you to please contact us and we can see what we can help you advocate for. And this just quickly, if your child already has a transition plan, you've probably seen this section, and it's just what the transition assessments look like in your child's IEP. Okay, and so this is just an example IEP from ISB, so yours might look a little bit different, but the important thing is that the age-appropriate transition assessments have to address this employment, education and training, and if applicable to your child, independent living skills. So there should be assessments that address each of these areas. And so the next thing after the assessments is to look at the post-secondary outcomes and goals. So this is figuring out, all right, so we see where your child is at, and now we want to look at where do they want to be. And just like your regular IEP goals, that these should fit the same criteria, those SMART goals that are specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, time specific. The difference here is that now they're focused on employment, education or training, and independent living. And again, just like your IEP goals, these must be individualized, so they should take into consideration your child's strengths, preferences, and interests. And just like your IEP goals, these are reviewed annually. So those should be updated annually, just like the regular IEP goals, and they require criteria for completion and progress reports. So you should get that same accountability that you're supposed to get from your child's IEP goals with these transition goals. Another note is what we see and what we would like to see is that these goals should become more specific the closer your child gets to graduation or to completing high school. So those should be more specific as you go. So for example, your child might have a more vague, broad goal of their dream when they're 14 and a half, but as they get through high school, they'll develop more specific goals developed around whether they want to go to college or what type of job they want to get, or how they want to live after graduation, if they want to live independently, and what those skills look like. And one of the big things we see too, and before I talk about these big goals, is that a lot of times you'll see our kids have big goals and they have big dreams, and that's great, and we want to support that, but want to make sure that these goals also break down those big dreams into realistic steps so that they're actually working towards a goal or working towards being in their field of interest. So some good examples of goals are things like Laura will go to a 4-year college and major in math. Those are specific things that she can be working towards. Jane will ride the train by herself for her job at the bakery and get employer offered training to improve her skills. Specific goals that break down exactly what needs to be provided, and measurable results. Some bad examples, and these are things that we see very often in transition plans, is that a child will complete exploration of career options or post-secondary education options after graduation. The idea is that this plan is supposed to help your child while they're still in school. And so want to make sure that those goals hold the school accountable for providing the services they need. And again, like we just talked about, sometimes they have really big dreams. Our kids have big dreams, and it's hard to dissuade them. And you don't want to break anybody down, but also want to make sure that this transition process is helpful. And there are ways to do that. So for example, this case of Matthew, who wants to be an NFL player, instead, this transition plan can be focused on figuring out what can we give Matthew, what other things might Matthew be interested in, and from his focus on the NFL, to kind of push him to post-secondary success. All right, so another check-in question. Does your child have appropriate transition goals? Looks like we're seeing a lot of people are seeing that there's some that are appropriate, but not all of their child's goals are appropriate. And that's an important thing to recognize, that some goals are okay, but that all of them should meet these requirements as we move forward.
My mouse is very light to the touch to move these slides along, so I just want to make sure I didn't skip anything. I'm just going to go back for a minute. Okay, I think we're good. Sorry about that.
You're good. So this is just another example of what that IEP looks like or can look like. And again, so those goals should relate to employment, education, or training. So in this case, you can have a goal focused on post-secondary education or training, whichever one applies to your child, and independent living. That's not to say you can't have both an education and a training goal, but they only have to have one in the IEP. So the next thing, so after you've got your assessments, post-secondary goals, then should come the course of study. Now this tends to be pretty vague. So it should list every course your student is required to take in order to graduate, but it tends to just be kind of that direct list of English 1, English 2, those direct requirements. But you can make it more specialized, and it should be individualized to meet your child's needs. So if you know that your child wants to go into a vocational program for culinary skills after they graduate, well, if there's a culinary course, that's something that you can request or can advocate to be put in this course of study, along with the things that we've seen are career development courses or advisory courses that are supposed to help students develop those transition skills and the things that they need to be functional after school. And because students are eligible for special education services until they're 22, this means there should be a place for additional courses. So after year 4, or your child might still be enrolled in school. And so the team should consider what courses your child should be involved in and beyond those traditional 4 years of high school. And just want to note, a lot of times with CPS, we see this being very vague. But you can always advocate for more clarity in what courses are being provided. So a lot of times we'll see things like just elective. And so you can ask for that to be clarified and make sure that this says what your child is supposed to be receiving. All right, and then so once we get through the assessments and the goals and the course of study, then we're finally to the transition services. So this really is those services that are going to be provided to help your child with their academic and functional achievement. And so these should be based on everything that we've talked about so far, on those assessments, on your child's goals, on the classes that they're taking. And so when we think about transition services, we want to think about, what does your child want to achieve? So what are their goals? What are they trying to get to? And then what do they need to get to those goals? And that's where we get our services. So again, you can see this is what kind of the IEP, sample IEP looks like, but just want to walk through. So the transition services have to include services related to instruction. So this can be taking specific courses, receiving tutoring, ACT prep classes, transportation training. So that's kind of the curriculum side of things. And then it also has to include community experiences, and those can vary based on what your child needs, right? So it can look at helping your child figure out how to buy groceries on their own, or volunteering at an animal shelter, opening up a bank account, figuring out how to look for apartments. It can look like a lot of different things. It can also be job shadowing and work experiences. So it depends on these services, again, should just be individualized to your child. And we should see that all the way through the plan, from assessments to services. Another must is that it must include job and other adult living objectives. So this is where you'll see things like practice interviewing, getting a driver's license, learning how to be your own advocate, which is a really critical skill that we want to make sure that all kids graduate with. So in addition to the must-haves in the transition services, you also can include some additional things. So there's daily living skills. If those are applicable to your child, those should be included, whether that's hygiene skills or organization. This can also include a functional vocational evaluation. So this really breaks down looking at your child in a job environment, right? What their career interests are, their aptitudes, their skills, and really gives you that information in a situational setting. We will say that we see CPS do this very rarely. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't advocate for it, but just want to prepare people that it's something that we don't see done very often.
And I'll just say too, from anecdotal experience, that sometimes I think with, thinking about things, obviously, I mean, daily living skills applies to everybody, and that, but also like functional vocational assessment. It can be that students that, how do I say this, in a way that maybe students who are a certain level of functioning are kind of students that may be targeted for this type of assessment, but we've definitely worked with students who, kind of would be sort of deemed higher functioning students, that still, based on all the sort of concrete skills that you'd have to be able to do to be successful in a competitive post-secondary employment situation, and especially if that student is planning to access any sort of further training or education in order to meet their post-secondary employment goals, oftentimes do have skills that are lacking, and kind of with the support of having a more comprehensive evaluation helps to make sure that students remain eligible to receive services and receive the services that they need to really be successful when they're leaving school. So I would say Emily's right, and we talked about this in preparing for this, that I think sort of more generally, I don't know that I've truthfully ever seen CPS do this well and in the way that's intended, but also just not to sort of make the mistake of assuming that this is only for a specific subset of students, even if that's the type of feedback you might get in response. And again, if you finding yourself encountering difficulty with these kinds of things, definitely reach out to us.
So another section of transition services that may be included are linkages after graduation. And this is something that we saw that we got a lot of questions about, or these are those adult services and those connections through the school. So the school should connect you to applicable organizations and agencies is after your child graduates. Some of these provide services during school, and then some of them just provide adult services. And we'll walk through a few of these in the next few slides. So the Illinois Division of Rehabilitative Services, or DORS, that's often called, it helps provide support for employment, education, and independent living opportunities for individuals with disabilities, and it can provide a lot of transition assistance. So DORS provides services for students while they're still in school, as well as adult services. So you might have heard of some programs that schools will do, like Fast Track or the STEP program, that you can ask about whether your school has implemented or that your child could enroll in.
Yeah, and I'll just jump in here and say, I guess, kind of like we said before, we're not as expert in these services, although we're really, kind of with Emily on board to kind of have this project with a focus. We're hoping to kind of become more versed. But some of these programs that Doors has run in the past, like STEP and Fast Track, they're grant funded. So it just depends on the school district and the school and sort of how actively they're participating in these programs and providing them. But I would say that, the school district certainly has a responsibility to make sure that, students are linking with these services. But I think, taking proactive steps as parents is a helpful thing too. And honestly, just like following up consistently and often is a good way to make sure that, your students are on, able to access the services that they have. And it's kind of interesting because there is a department, I know we were talking a lot about CPS, but they're within CPS that's specifically supposed to be, they're kind of like technical assistance advisors for schools and IEP teams on transition services. And I, think it's okay for me to share this. That's something that they had kind of let us know. They have a couple of folks who work in that department that are specifically there to make sure that CPS students are linking up with Doors in the way that they should be when they're getting ready to leave school, and that their experience has been that in some particular areas, Doors is actually an underutilized resource, which is something I found really surprising to hear, because I always think of adult services and why we so, kind of heavily advise families to, have their kids stay in school if you think that there's more support that is needed before your child's ready to make a successful transition, because the entitlement is just more protective in special education in terms of what services are available. And then on the other side, Emily mentioned that the Department of or Division of Developmental Disabilities has like a 7-year wait list right now, right? So anyways, it seems like there's resources at Doors, right? And so it's just a matter of like being really persistent and following up and making sure that you're accessing services. So it may be that you just have to take more proactive steps as parents, but this is a good resource to be trying to access. And one other thing I'll just mention that we don't have as much experience with right now, but are hoping to kind of get, is that there's new directive from the Federal Department of Education saying that students can simultaneously be eligible, like providing real clarification that you can be eligible to receive services through an adult service agency like Doors while simultaneously still receiving special education services. So there should be more of a symbiotic relationship between these two service systems. And so I think we're hoping through Emily's project that we can kind of help to sort of figure that out a little bit better with this, clarity and guidance on the fact that the idea is that you want to, kind of wrap around kids and making sure they're getting all the support they need to be successful and to make that seamless transition when they're leaving school.
Can you tell us what STEP stands for?
Oh gosh, I'll be honest and say I don't know what the acronym stands for, and I truthfully don't even know where they're running that program right now, or if it was a grant, like I said, a grant-funded program that Doors had like several years ago, and so I can try to dig around, and we can try to dig around and get you some more information about it, but I don't know offhand what it stands for. Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure. I think the idea behind it was to make sure that people who are Doors counselors were accessing students earlier to try to address this problem of, and then making sure that if there's anything that agency could provide to school districts to make sure that they were doing a better job in providing some of these services that were more supportive of, their big focus is competitive employment, right? So I think, kind of helping with pre-vocational training and activities to kind of work with school districts to be able to embed those kinds of services within their own transition programs is kind of what the setup was. So. Oh, shoot. Sorry, Emily. This keeps doing this. I'm sorry, guys. Okay. I'm just not going to touch it or breathe near it right now.
So the linkages part is that you can get a referral to Doors to access these services. So like we talked about before, this is employment services, education, independent living, and these are services that you can connect with, your child can connect with before graduating, before leaving high school. And so you can do that through a case manager. You can also look at the Doors website and apply directly with them. But you can also get a referral from the school.
Yeah, and the point, sorry, I know I keep jumping in here, but I think the point that we just want to hammer is that school districts have a standard of care that's a little different from what is required of an adult serving agency like DOORS, which is just to kind of provide the services where students have a very strong entitlement to make appropriate progress towards both measurable annual goals and then also these post-secondary goals. And so while it's great to kind of explore and to get your children connected with all the services that they can access, and again, trying to get them connected and on the caseload at DOORS before they end up having to leave school, whether it be because they're ready to graduate or they're aging out. But, you know, thinking about how can you kind of, we don't like to use this word, but maximize your kids' entitlement to special education services, because again, I think what is potentially available under that framework is supposed to, in theory, be more supportive. So.
And just a little bit, and like Amanda said, so we're not experts on these adult services, but wanted to give you a little bit of background from the information that we do know. So another option is the Division of Developmental Disabilities. So provide similar support along with potentially home-based support. This is, if you've heard of the wait list, this is what people are talking about. So this is the PUNS wait list. And so your child may already be on the PUNS list as a child, and it should automatically transfer over when they turn 18 to the adult wait list, but would still recommend that you follow up with DD and just make sure that your child is on that list. If you need to figure out how to get your child on the list, you can contact your PASS agent. And so there's this number here. You can also find it on their website, how to link up with your agent and get your child on the list. And so some of the services that they can provide are residential living arrangements, in-home supports, day services. And so this can look very different depending on your child's needs. But again, this is what we were talking about kind of at the beginning of the presentation, that right now that wait list can be up to 7 years. And sometimes depending on your child's needs, it might go quicker. So definitely don't want to dissuade anybody from applying for these services, but just want to flag that it can be a while before you receive services.
I just want to say that you're supposed to renew it every year. So that's usually the case. And it's difficult for two-parent households to get put on or taken off the PUNS list and given services in Illinois right now. Mm-hmm. Just FYI.
The other two kind of bits of information that we were able to get from our colleague that I think are helpful is that, so our agency is actually involved in a class action litigation. LIGAS is the name of the case, and that's where this name, LIGAS Family Advocate Program, comes from. And the idea behind it was to provide more community-based support so people with developmental disabilities weren't as often required to kind of be in residential and congregate care facilities when they're adults. It's supposed to promote, community integration. But anyways, so part of what the state agreed as part of the way that case was resolved was that I think our colleague told us it's within the next couple of years, but they're committing that the wait list will go down to 5 years, which is still really long, right? So it's especially critical to make sure that as soon as your child's 18th birthday hits, that you make sure that they're on that adult waiting list. And then the other piece of information that hopefully the people who are working at these PASS agencies would know and would tell you is that there's a difference between being classified as planning for services versus seeking services, and that it's really critical to make sure that you're classified as seeking services, because otherwise you don't have the same guarantee of moving, off of the wait list as quickly. So if that's helpful to know. That was something I wouldn't have otherwise had any idea about. So.
And then another adult service is the Centers for Independent Living. And so these are non-residential community-based organizations that can provide resources and advocacy and support. And again, this is one that's region and geographic specific. So if you go to their website that's listed on here, you can figure out where your local Center for Independent Living is and what services they provide. So they might provide different services and have different programs and grant funded programs that might even help your child while they're still in school. So we definitely recommend that you reach out to them. like I said, they provide a support with housing and independent living and employment. Right, so those were some of the linkages that can be included in the transition services. Like we said before, those aren't the must-haves that have to be included, but they're definitely ones that may be included and ones that you may want to advocate for your child. And just like any other services in your child's IEP, I just quickly want to show you that the IEP should show this information: the date, the frequency, the location, how long, so that the school district should be held accountable for providing these services. And so you should be able to see exactly what's being provided to your child and when. And if this is an area that you're looking at your child's IEP and you're not sure if it's right, or you think that there's something wrong with it, we definitely recommend that you reach out and we can take a look at it and see what advice we might be able to provide you as you move forward in your advocacy. And so some examples of transition services. So just like everything else that we've talked about tonight, this is meant to be individualized. So it's going to look different, and it could be a variety of things. And your child's not limited to just one service or one type of service, but could be receiving a variety of these things. So it can be instruction with specific courses that they're attending, community experiences, job placement programs, daily living skills, behavior, can even include related services if those are the supports that your child needs to be successful after school, and can include their special education and their evaluations, those functional vocational evaluations we were talking about. So those transition services can look very different, and they should continue to be individualized to your child and should change over time based on your child's needs. So one of the services we kind of wanted to highlight, and this is something that historically we haven't seen really utilized and really used for students, but just want to highlight that students have the ability to do this, to be dual enrolled. So this means that students who are in high school can still receive IEP services under the IDEA while taking post-secondary education courses. So whether that's at a community college, at a larger university, or in a post-secondary education or post-secondary vocational training program. So they can continue to receive services. So for example, if your child needed services to work on executive functioning skills and needed those supports, or needed speech language therapy to continue, but wanted to try an English class at the college, they should be able to do that. The one requirement is that students still have to meet those requirements for enrollment at that institution. So if there is a GPA requirement for enrolling at the community college, they have to meet that. So this is a helpful option to consider, especially if your child is wanting to do a post-secondary program or attend college, but wants to kind of work their way into it. This could be a really good option.
Yeah, I'll just kind of quickly add here that if people are interested in kind of looking at this stuff, I think it's something we'd be interested in sort of figuring out what the best sort of, avenue for pursuing this from a legal perspective, if folks are having difficulty accessing it. And then the other thing I think is just important to note here is that kids don't have a right to an IEP in college. You have right to reasonable accommodations and modifications under Section 504, which is another law that has a lot of overlap with the laws that govern special education, but it's more of like an anti-discrimination framework. And so the way that tends to bear out in colleges is that what's considered to be a reasonable accommodation versus a fundamental alteration of the program can sort of be guided a bit by kind of what the standards that each individual institution sets. And so I think, there's certainly plenty of post-secondary educational options in the Chicago area that probably do a good job in providing those kinds of supports to students with disabilities, but it's an important thing to talk to, the Disability Support Services office at those institutions to make sure that, you and your child understand what it is that they're going to require, in terms of documentation and what kinds of accommodations they can provide. And then the other important piece about that is it's all self-identification, right? So unless, your child as an adult discloses that they're a person with a disability, the college may not know, right? So it's just really important to kind of you know, make sure everybody understands what is available that way. And so that's sort of, you know, veering off in a little bit of a different direction, I guess, kind of tying it back into the slide, if it seems like it would be helpful to sort of ease that transition for your child to have the kind of support that they're getting through their IEP, and to be able to kind of figure out how to, you know, kind of rely less and less on that. This could be a really useful option to pursue to kind of make that transition more seamless.
And we know right now remote learning is a hot topic and a tough issue. So just wanted to highlight that just like the rest of your child's IEP, your child is still entitled to these services, even if we're working remotely. And they might look different and we might have to adjust a bit, but they still should be getting these services. And so schools can be flexible with this. And honestly, it might take you proposing some of these things to happen before they actually do happen. Because we're not seeing a whole lot of this happening already, but you can still, these things can be done. So for example, we've seen virtual career presentations, so like a virtual career fair that a school can put together, or informational interviews and job shadowing online, because we're all working online, working on professional communication skills, virtual job site trips, and working on skills in the home. If a student is working on functional living skills, well, that's a great opportunity.
So sorry, just one other really quick thing I'll say about, I mean, we're still kind of, we're figuring this out, because obviously this is uncharted territory for everybody. And so I think, you know, one thing, I don't know if anybody here is in this sort of position right now, or if your child is already accessing kind of a more transition focused program where there's a lot of sort of community-based opportunities that are embedded as part of that. Obviously, it's going to be like next to impossible to replicate some of that stuff right now. And so I think, you know, in theory, we certainly will fight vigorously and hope that students are going to be entitled to compensatory education for those missed opportunities. So I think, you know, and those of you who've been to other presentations we've given, it probably feels a little like, you know, not the most satisfying answer at this point to just kind of document, and, you know, keep track of what those missed opportunities are, and sort of how, you know, schools are or are not meeting your child's goals right now, and just being, you know, armed with that information. We can, you know, once we are starting to see a little bit of the other side of this, and there are actual, you know, tangible opportunities to be participating in that kind of, those kinds of educational opportunities, again, we can, you know, sort of see if there's a way to kind of either extend the time frame for which students can be receiving services, or coming up with some sort of solution that'll help to account for some of those deficiencies that are just inherent in what's happening right now. And then I got a question. I'm just going to go ahead and say it, because I'm just talking and managing the Q&A at the same time just gets to be a little bit a lot sometimes. But I think, yeah, and Mary actually already responded to this. So I don't think CPS has anything formal set up, although I feel like they should. So like I said, it's something that we'd be really interested in working with families to try to support. So definitely, you know, reach out to us and Emily specifically if it's something that you know, think would be a useful programming option for your child.
And we realize, you know, services kind of generally, it's a question with remote learning, but just want to know, has your child received transition services during this remote learning period, whether it was in the spring or since we've started back at school? It looks like so far we're a bit split, that some people are receiving services and some are not. That kind of seems to be the case across the board. So, and it is hard to know, right? With the way that remote learning is taking place, it's hard to figure out kind of what services are being provided. But like Amanda said, whatever you're able to document, whether it's that your child is receiving some but not all of their services, or they're not receiving anything at all, would encourage you to definitely document that and keep track of it as we go through this process. So that being said, I want to talk a little bit about what if the transition plan is not appropriate, or these services are not being provided at all. Just want to highlight that the school is still responsible for appropriate transition planning and services, regardless of economic conditions, how involved the parent is, how engaged your student is, or failures of other agencies. So that's a point that I wasn't previously aware of, and just want to highlight is that even if another agency is meant to be providing these services and stops doing so, the school is still responsible for those services. And so any failure to provide these services or providing inappropriate services can be considered a denial of FAPE, a denial of their free appropriate public education. And so some examples that we've seen of this are, if there's not measurable goals, kind of similar to your child's, the rest of your child's IEP, not seeing comprehensive transition assessments. And like Amanda said, that's kind of a tough area because there's not concrete what exactly has to be done at every step. It can be hard to show that those assessments were not sufficient. Or predetermination, generic plans. We see that a lot, that there are generic programs for students. And the key is that it may be a denial of FAPE, but only if those services aren't providing what your child needs. So you have to be able to show that it's not meeting your child's needs, even if it's a generic program. And so the dispute resolution option. So if your child is not being provided with FAPE, these are some of your options. And I know some of you are familiar, but wanted to highlight some of the issues, common issues that we see and are seeing right now with the different dispute resolution options. So you can ask for an independent educational evaluation, and that would be paid for by the school district. You are allowed to get an independent educational evaluation at any time if you would like to pay for it yourself, and the school must consider it. But in order for the school to pay for it, you have to request it from them, and they have the option of either granting it and paying for that IEE, or they can file for due process. And we just want to highlight that we see often that CPS does file for due process to defend their own evaluations or their decision not to evaluate. And that doesn't mean that you shouldn't ask for an IEE, but just means that you should be prepared for that argument coming from the school district if that's the route that you would like to go. You can also ask for an IEP meeting to discuss your concerns and discuss the transition plan itself. You can request mediation and to reach an agreement out of court with the district. Mediation is completely voluntary, so it might be that the school district declines your request for mediation. And so that can definitely happen. And then you can also request a due process hearing. So one thing we wanted to flag about that due process hearing right now is that with COVID, we're seeing much longer delays in due process hearing requests than previously. And while it's supposed to be a much shorter process and supposed to get a quick decision for your child, hearing dates are being scheduled more than 6 months out. So just want to flag that. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't request due process if that's what needs to happen for your child, but just want to give you a heads up that that's taking a lot longer than usual.
I'll just say it was taking that long before COVID hit. So I think it's just a general problem that ISB is having right now, just with the number of cases that are being filed and how many people they have assigned to be hearing officers. I mean, the one thing, and again, if we're talking about CPS, sometimes I hate saying this, but they'll take it more seriously. And there are sort of embedded as part of that process options for dispute resolution, including potentially mediation or something called a resolution meeting. So again, I think if you're just kind of thinking about what the best way is to approach a situation like that, just call our helpline and we can kind of give you more guidance just based on what we think would be the most sort of efficient way of solving the problem, depending on, kind of what the specific issue is. And it should, Emily's absolutely right though, it should be moving faster than it is.
And then the last option is to file a state complaint. So to file a complaint with ISB, and just want to flag that this tends to be kind of limited remedies that you're going to get through this process because it's the state investigation. And a lot of times they kind of punt back to the IEP team and say, hey, all right, there's a violation here, IEP team figure out how to fix it, which may or may not be the best option depending on kind of the situation that you're dealing with and what remedies you're looking for your child. So again, like Amanda said, if you're at a point where you're looking for dispute resolution and you're not really sure what to do, feel free to call our helpline and we can kind of help you walk you through it and go through kind of the pros and cons of the different options depending on your specific situation. So we just wanted to touch on a few other transition issues, so some things that come up when you're reaching transition age. So the first is age of majority. So during that period from 14 and a half to 22, obviously your child turns 18. And so 18 is the age of majority in Illinois, and that means that's the transfer of your child's rights. So then they have the right to make their own decisions. You should be notified about this from the school when your child is 17. So you have a year to get information and to kind of figure out next steps. But not always happens. So just wanted to flag that transfer happens at 18. Your child can decide to delegate their educational decision-making rights to you. So they can sign in permission for you to make their educational decision-making right, or they can assign permission for you to make their educational decisions. This form, there's an ISB form for this that you can find, and we can send if you are interested in this. And it lasts for 1 year, and it can be revoked at any time. So your child can change their mind and take that back. Even if your child doesn't give you consent or give this delegation, they can consent for you to be in the meeting with them. And then they just make the final decision. So you can still be involved in the process, even if your child has not delegated their rights to you.
This is a fairly obvious point, but just to clarify, so it's that it's valid for 1 year, right? So a student can obviously choose to execute another delegation of education decision-making. It's just you have to pay attention to when that year expires, so that, and the IEP team should be paying attention to that and kind of updating you about it, but that doesn't always happen. And then, you know, I know people maybe had some questions about this stuff, but if you have a adult guardianship, you know, I know that the sort of move is in the direction of trying to carve out places where adults can still make some decisions for themselves, even if they need support in certain areas. But if you're kind of looking to do it through that process, then just, you know, making sure that education decision-making is part of that. So that would cover things as well, if you know, end up deciding to go that route.
So another point to talk about is graduation. So your child's eligibility for special education ends when they graduate with a regular high school diploma. So that doesn't include a GED or a certificate of completion, but a diploma that meets the state requirements. And so that ends their eligibility. But there's the option to delay their graduation. So if your child needs further education and programming, including transition services, they can stay in school longer. So eligibility can last up until their 22nd birthday. And so that's an important thing to note, that you can request this delay. But we do want to flag that the school does not have to agree to delay this graduation if your child has met the graduation requirements. So if they've met those state requirements, have taken those courses for a regular high school diploma, then the school does not have to agree to delay graduation. If you're in disagreement with the school about graduation, this is again another issue that you can use dispute resolution options to resolve. Another point is that graduation is a change in placement. So that means that it has to be discussed at the IEP meeting and that you have to have notice of it. So you should receive prior written notice that your child is going to be graduated and when that's supposed to happen. So some examples of improper graduations are if your student didn't receive the appropriate services that they were supposed to receive before graduation, or if you're not provided notice or given the opportunity to meaningfully participate in a conversation about graduation. And so then another point is the summary of performance. So when your child ages out of special education or receives a regular high school diploma, the school has to provide a summary of performance. So this is supposed to be a summary of your child's academic achievement and their functional performance, so where they're at. And this can be a really helpful tool for your child as they continue to advocate for themselves, whether that's in employment or education, and it can outline what they need, what services and accommodations they need to be successful in different environments. And it should be developed with the IEP team. So again, that should include you and your child and the entire team that's been working with your child throughout high school to really develop a summary of performance that explains where your child's at and what they need to be able to move forward. So we have an example that we can walk through and kind of point out some of the issues that we see and some ways that those could be resolved. But we also realize that a lot of you might have questions or other issues that you would like to talk about. So want to give that opportunity if people would rather do that or would like to go through an example.
If you have a strong opinion either way, if you just want to land in the chat, and then, you know, whoever answers first will get first dibs on what we do.
I'd like to hear the example.
Okay. All right. So we're going to talk about Jonathan. And so forgive me for reading from the slide, but just want to make sure we all are on the same page. So Jonathan is a student with a learning disability who graduated high school in 4 years because he had the credits to graduate. But with only a 5th grade reading level, no work experience, and poorly developed social skills, Jonathan could not find a job. His transition plan had focused on researching college programs, but he didn't want to go to college. He had never written a resume and did not know where to look for jobs. He didn't think that he had any skills that an employer would like. So we're going to walk through this just like we walked through before, looking first at transition assessments. So notice that Jonathan said he didn't think he had any skills an employer would like. So he doesn't know what skills he does have. And this is where an appropriate transition assessment can really help, because it can help identify both strengths and weaknesses. So it doesn't just show us what we need to work on, but also what skills a student already has. And like we said before, these transition assessments should be revisited every year. So your child should have up-to-date assessments when they leave high school to be able to inform whether that's looking for jobs or figuring out educational accommodations. And then moving on to talking about post-secondary outcomes and goals. So Jonathan's goals is we see that he has a transition plan that's focused on researching college programs, but he didn't want to go to college. His goals did not match his own interests and preferences. So those post-secondary outcomes and goals, because they guide those your child's transition services, should match what your child actually wants, so that we can match up their skill level, their goals, and services. And then course of study. So we say that Jonathan has a learning disability and he graduated high school in 4 years because he had the credits, but he didn't have an appropriate reading level. He had a 5th grade reading level. So he had the opportunity to stay and to get the skills that he needed in high school. So the course of study should have considered whether he should stay for an additional year or additional programming and to get the services he needed to be successful after school. And then finally, his transition services. So we see that Jonathan had no work experience, poorly developed social skills, and really that hurt him in being able to find a job. He had never written a resume and he didn't know where to look for jobs. Those are all things that can be provided through transition services. And those are guided by his appropriate assessments and goals, right? So his goals said that he wanted to go to college when that's not what he really wanted, and instead he was focused on finding a job. And because those goals weren't aligned and he wasn't getting the services that he needed to be able to find a job, to look at how to write a resume, how to look for jobs in the first place, and how to make applications and do interviews. So all of these pieces work together to provide an appropriate transition plan and to provide the services that a student needs to be successful with post-secondary education, employment, and independent living. And so this was just an example to show kind of how those pieces work together and how each of those, when we correct them and we make sure that they're appropriate for your child, can really change post-secondary outcomes. And so the remedies that we talked about, so we talked about this a little bit walking through it, that if Jonathan had gotten appropriate vocational assessments, and these are some of the things that if this was the case that that Jonathan walked to us that we could try and get afterwards, is to get him appropriate vocational assessments to figure out where he's at. And there's the option, it's not a commonly used remedy, but to get rescission of the diploma. So if his diploma was granted and it shouldn't have been, and some hearing officers will take that diploma back to reinstate their eligibility, but we've also, there's also precedent for just reinstating eligibility or providing compensatory educational services to a student after they've graduated because they didn't receive what they were supposed to get while they were in school. So whether that's providing tutoring or job coaching assistance, those are some of the options that a student like Jonathan could get if he wasn't provided with what he was supposed to get during school. And so this slide just shows some of those remedies that we just talked about. And again, so just want to make sure that everyone has our information for the special education hotline, and we can provide self-advocacy assistance. We can kind of answer some of those questions so we know, like what we talked about, if you're not sure if your child's getting appropriate assessments or that their services are correct. Those are some things that you can come to us about, as well as legal advocacy in select cases. So this is the helpline number that you can call to get those services and do a free intake with us. And you can also visit our website, which has a lot of services, including a transition planning module that you can walk through yourself and with your child to kind of figure out your own plan and walk through those steps before going into an IEP meeting and talking about this with the team. If you have any further questions about this presentation or about transition services, please contact me. My information is on this slide, and I would be more than happy to help. If anybody has any questions, we have some time to answer questions.
Yeah, we have some time for questions, and then really quick, just so I can catch as many people as possible.
Yeah.
So we really appreciate you guys. If you don't mind, we're going to launch one more poll, which just has some pretty basic questions about how useful you found the presentation or not. It's helpful for us, you know, obviously for planning moving forward. And then based on how we're funded, some of our grant programs that fund our work want us to keep track of this information and report on it. So we really appreciate it if you guys don't mind responding to this when I launch it right now. And then like Emily said, we're happy to hang around and answer questions, you know, to the extent that's helpful. I'll leave it up for just like a minute or two.
So I know this was a lot of information. So if there's anything that you think of later or you have additional follow-up questions, please feel free to reach out and we'll try our best to answer them or direct you to someone who can.
Kelly has a question. Kelly, yeah, go ahead.
So I have a question because I work in with children that have special healthcare needs, and there are some children that I don't know, they have very limited abilities, and I do not feel like the school system addresses or looks at what they're capable of. Any suggestions on how to get the school system to look at that and to look at what their strengths are rather than what their weaknesses are?
Yeah, that's a tough question because it's a tough situation that we see a lot. I think one of the things that we've seen and in those circumstances are getting evaluations and assessments, whether that's the functional vocational evaluation, to really highlight those skill strengths and be able to focus on those things to make sure that students get programming to develop those strengths and really don't end up like you're talking about not getting the services based on that deficit mindset.
There is also too, and I just haven't seen it done as much here, so it's something I just kind of know about, like more so in theory than actual practice, but there's another type of assessment called person-centered planning that is kind of, I think, like evidence-based best practices for young adults who have more significant disabilities, because it can be difficult to have a student with that level of need, you know, respond to an interest inventory or be able to gather information. And certainly just knowing like functionally what a student is able to do, the types of skills that are assessed through a functional vocational evaluation is helpful, but it's more kind of like you involve everybody who's involved in the student's care and ask them questions too. So it's a process where everybody's kind of participating and looking at what are the different facets of how you know, this person is going to be able to live happily and as independently as possible when they're getting ready to leave school. So it is, I think, something in theory that should be part of, I don't know if you guys can tell this, like, you know, issue of transition assessments is something that's like just personally very interesting to me and something where I'd like to see a lot of improvement in how school districts are supporting students and families. And so I think there are probably some resources that I would just have to, I'm not as like personally knowledgeable about who's doing it here. Or who's doing well. There is one organization that's based out of Evanston called the Center for Independent Futures that does has their own sort of like branded program that they, you know, is basically essentially a version of person-centered planning. But that, I hope that sort of answers the question, right? Because that's a way to sort of look at this stuff more comprehensively and to ensure that things are being appropriately individualized and we're not just setting really low expectations for young adults with disabilities.
That is helpful. Thank you.
Sure.
Any other questions? I put a few more documents in the chat. We were talking about the summary of performance. We've got a mock one that you can take a look at to see what's in it. A resume template for someone with special needs and a mock transition plan too that our intern worked on over the summer. She's a special ed student at Vanderbilt. She's awesome. Sophie. Any other questions?
I think you probably said, somebody just asked a question about whether the slides in the video will be available to watch at a later point. So I'll let you take that one, but I just want to make sure we didn't leave it unanswered.
Okay, I am going to send the slides and we will post the video on our website. So you'll get the slides in an email within the next week. And anything else before we wrap up? I want to thank Emily and Amanda. Thank you so much for giving us this presentation. It's really valuable. I learned a lot. I've got a 19-year-old, so we're right in the middle of it.
Oh, yeah. Well, thank you all so much for having us and for participating tonight. Really appreciate it. And really, if you have further questions, please contact us. If there's a way that we can help, we want to help.
Okay. All right. Thanks. All right. Good night, everyone.
All right. Thank you so
Good night,
much.
everyone.
We appreciate
Thank you.
it. Take good care.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Irene.